Добрый вечер, уважаемые.
Dear colleagues, good evening. We're about to start with panel number 4, the regulatory sandbox. Game without rules or rules without the game. First, of course, the central bank has already launched its sandbox, which is the mechanism where financial services and technologies can be trialed, where pilots could run, where new products and technologies could be tested, where the hypotheses can be tested, and where we can find whether these hypotheses can provide an improvement. This is not the first of its kind. Such regulatory sandboxes have been created elsewhere in a number of countries. So we're here today to discuss this experience, to discuss whether the Russian case is unique in any sense, and discuss the first results from the sandbox, and also discuss its future. Several projects have already been run in the sandbox, therefore we have some preliminary conclusions. You should be aware that before the project can be tested in a sandbox, it has to go through a number of funnels or sieves, so to say, where they are selected out of a number of applications. I work in the interagency committee led by Tatiana Zharkova, Managing Director at FinTech Association. Out of 26 applications, which tended to be more oriented towards cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology originally, now the focus seems to be shifting to other fields in fintech, and it's actually more interesting to us because we now have a broader range of applications, and the applications seem to talk to different needs of the market. We have a very professional panel: Anatoly Popov, Deputy Board Chairman at Sberbank; Edi Astanin, Head of the Board of the National Depository. We also have Mr. Zemin, Acting Director at the Financial Technology Department at Bank of Russia. Skolkovo is represented by head of its IT. Tatiana Zharkova, Managing Director of FinTech Association, will join us in a moment. She is now completing her participation in a different panel. John Mason is also here with us, working for Thomson Reuters, and as far as I know, UK was a pioneer in such sandbox approach, so it would be very interesting to hear from the British experience. My first question is to Anatoly Popov. We know that Sberbank led the way in establishing the regulatory sandbox. Sberbank offered a number of projects they believed it would be worthwhile to test in the sandbox mode. They focused on paperless documentary chain that would help many organizations, and I think these projects have already led to legislative initiatives, and central bank is updating its documentation based on these test runs. Anatoly will discuss that in more detail, I believe. And I'd like to highlight that one of the projects that we thus tested has allowed us to take into account ICO and tokens into our regulatory framework. So this has been very useful. So Anatoly, the floor is yours. How was it And what do you think needs to be changed for the Sandbox to be even more efficient? Anatoly, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity and thank you for our joint effort, because I believe Bank of Russia and the State Duma are working together, as are many other stakeholders. Together we're looking for an answer to the question, how do we change things so that I don't have to go to the bank? Less paper trail, less physical presence, more opportunities. We've been working fairly intensively from February onwards, and there is a number of significant results. The checkbook and the request for cash has been cancelled. This is the first update to the documentary trial. The checkbook has been introduced in 1949, so it's been around for almost 90 years. It hardly changed during that period, so they just replaced Soviet Union for Russia there when the country changed. And of course the document was of the highest standard, so you couldn't do any harm to the checkbook. And finally, in just 3 months, we were able to upgrade it by eliminating it. So a fantastic result. Another good result is the booklet with signature examples and with stamps examples, where a business can gather together all of these insignia, so to say. And under previous legislation, or say in the 1980s, when companies were more local, where we didn't have as many big chains, global companies, but now, thanks to global technology, the digital world has expanded so much. And now if a company wants to do changes to this collection of stamps and signatures, then by the original legislation it had to be done at the very specific office where it was originally collected. Now, thanks to regulatory Sandbox, we've updated that, and you don't have to keep that in your branch offices, because this is a big risk when your branch office employees have access to this information. This is sensitive, and it also gives green light to digitally updating this collection remotely. If the employee in charge is replaced by someone else, then you can do that digitally and remotely. The next project we would like to pilot is the digital charter project, when the bank has to look at the company's charter and they are in print, and so you'll have to request that and check that. So about 1/3 of what we have to archive. Last year we archived around 640,000 documents, boxes. So about 1/3 of that volume were the copies of company charters. So now we've halved that, and I hope that we will be able to reduce that paper load, working together with the tax authority and central bank and so on. Next, the request to tax authorities for taxpayer history, profile, and so on. For instance, the Presidential Grants Foundation has asked us 2 years ago to help them facilitate their documentary trail. It's very difficult, of course, to receive the grant, but then the reporting that you have to do frequently is much more labor efficient than the actual work volume that you do for the grant, because you have to mail everything to Moscow. They used to have to check that manually. Now it's all digitized, and We send the information online, almost real time, to the foundation, and they can check the performance of this or that NGO almost online. Sergei Kirienko has noticed that thanks to that, the number of grant recipients from outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg have grown by 4 times, because it facilitated the paperwork, because the customer didn't have to go to the bank, bring things out, carry them to the office, and so on. I think there's a lot of opportunity here, and we really welcome that. Any improvements? You've asked about potential improvements. It takes a while to register things with the Ministry of Justice. Perhaps Ivan will be able to help us. Normally, when we already have the new legislative prepared, all the necessary documents are ready, and it takes as long as 2 months. As long as 2 months to register with the Ministry of Justice. Maybe you can digitize them. Absolutely. If you task us with that, I could clearly see a number of goals. Of course, state procurement, where it's now done electronically on these platforms, but then there's reporting. And state agencies have to report as well, and regions will have to report as well. And this is also tons and tons of paper. And your example with grants, I think, should be multiplied. Are you using the Moscow's parking system? You remember that you have to keep this paper ticket that you're given once you've paid. You just throw it away, right? So it's another example of how things are wasted. Many of us drive in central Moscow. And why do you have to receive this paper document, the receipt? I don't know. So I think Sberbank has plenty of room to expand even further with paper trail reduction. You've mentioned Bank of Russia and its mission and how it could influence things. When we were designing the Sandbox, we took into account the international experience, obviously, and I believe our Sandbox is great because it's not too focused, it's broad enough. It can work with a broad array of projects. In the UK, for instance, it was to boost competition. So this was a main characteristic of the project that could be test run in the Sandbox. There's also Singaporean experience and so on. Did you take into account, Ivan, this international experience when you were doing this? Good afternoon, colleagues. We haven't actually considered digitization of the Ministry of Justice, but I think it can be a good idea. The question said by Anatoly Gennadyevich about designing the regulatory sandbox to make sure it's simple, accessible, without much red tape. It's very important. Anatoly was right when he said that sometimes the documentary cycle is so long that a project can die before all the approvals have been received, because technologies change and we'll lag behind with digitization. We therefore, when we were designing the Sandbox, we wanted to make it as comfortable and as simple and as fast-paced as possible. We took into account the need to bring together a broad array of participants or stakeholders, rather, representatives of businesses that could understand the benefit of using this or that technology, state agencies which could evaluate the risks, which would understand the necessary needs in the regulatory frame that we'll have to follow. This is normally the biggest priority and the biggest obstacle in technology development. State agencies had to interact in order to understand and then change the regulatory policies that prevent new technologies from developing. Based on the experience that we've had so far, and based on the experiences from worldwide, the UK, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, we designed a model for Russia which does not copy an existing one from anywhere. We decided to start with an opportunity to test things without piloting technology in the real world. So we just test the technology first. What we see normally is pilot projects on specific operations or on smaller volumes or in some regions or some groups. We start with the evaluation of how the process itself works, and then we look at what changes have to be made to the regulatory framework. We, of course, consider the second stage where we will have to evaluate the impact, the real-life impact. We haven't had such cases yet. Out of the 27 applications that we've had, 2 have been successfully trialed. Anatoly has already described the first such success story, which we had this summer. I think it was a success, a genuine one. Now we're updating the Bank of Russia regulatory policies, which will streamline processes by canceling the signature collection that Anatoly has discussed earlier. Also, there's a new initiative jointly put forward by Sberbank and the national regulatory system that wants to well, as a side note, of course, running things in the sandbox can take time as well. It's not because we have a lot of red tape. It's because we want to have a comprehensive analysis. For every project, it turned out that there were many more questions that we originally couldn't foresee, and they came up when we were piloting that. And once we were finalizing the second project after its pilot, now that we believe that it should be implemented, that it can influence the financial market, now we have the joint recommendations for updates to the new legislation that Anatoly is now helping get through the State Duma, digital assets, crowdfunding, and an update to the Civic Code, these 3 pieces of legislation. So this is the result of our work in the sandbox. They have been augmented based on our experience in piloting the project with Sberbank. The first 2 cases have also made it clear that the sandbox should be improved. Applications turned out to not be examined in the best fashion possible, so we shortened this process, streamlined it once again, and we decided to spend more time on piloting rather than the preliminary selection, because the pilot stage is the stage where you get the experience that gives you the most challenges. So we also simplified the interface with the Bank of Russia. So now we have an initial consideration. We have 2 boards that discuss whether it's necessary to introduce this technology, with the industry representatives, with the state agencies, which discuss whether it can be done. And there's also the internal Bank of Russia committee, which collects all this information and then makes a decision that this technology can have a real-life impact and can be implemented. Independently of what that decision is going to be, we design a roadmap which brings together the legal and the technological aspect that discusses the potential changes to the legislation, and we connect with the state agencies that have to be in touch for that one. So I think this is the first such mechanism which really brings together different state agencies. All the other activities that we see, they take a lot of time. It's heavy to move things forward, and it really makes us lag behind. Therefore, I believe that Sandbox is a great tool and arguably the fastest mode to implement initiatives and new projects and solutions that could really help us digitize financial market and bring it up to a new level.
Спасибо, Иван.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Well, I would disclose a small secret to you. Since I'm chairman of the Intergovernmental Interministerial Commission, I can tell you that the decision is made not in a consensus in this way, but according to chart of the Commission, any decision can only move forward if the majority has voted in support of that. And the same applies to Sberbank project. They were later passed and they were supported by Sandbox, so to say, but there were objections to that as well. And that demonstrates the fact that we're very careful in our analysis. But luckily, the majority of the voices supported the project, and we see that it is now getting a new life. Ivan talked about the project connected with the ICO and organization of ICO. Obviously, the ICO is connected with blockchain, and in this regard, I have a question for Eddie, since the project was initiated by Sberbank, and the organization was specifically created for centralization, while blockchain is de facto a decentralized system. So why would R&D create something that would kill the centralized system? And once they've been through a lot and you have a large track record behind you, how would you assess the whole process? And how do you envisage the future? What is the future of the system? Centralized or decentralized system? Clearly, there would be some kind of resistance for them for a while. Which one would win? Which one would be more efficient? Thank you for your question. Well, we perceive digital assets as a blue ocean for us. We're there to analyze digital assets, and according to our assessments, the market of those digital assets is around $200 billion, and around 10% of them are managed by the Russian participants. So we hope that our experiment, together with the central bank, with FinTech, and Association of Sberbank, will enable us to create an infrastructure that will bring those activities back to the Russian jurisdiction. I have to say that we're, of course, just at the very beginning of our journey, and a Sandbox was an indicator of support of our activities from the side of a regulator. And that is principally important, because despite the fact that we're one of the leaders, and probably the leader in technology, in the industry of central depositories, we are an absolute leader, and I'll be happy to tell you about the project that is indeed very dominating in this regard. But without proper legislation, no technology aimed for institutional investors can work. And the demand from the side of institutional investors regarding the pension funds, and I'm talking about the foreign investors, is still there. And the very first requests that we received at different global forums, whether there will be proper infrastructure in place so that it would be possible not just for individuals with certain speculative moods, but for institutional investors, for which that type of assets would be no different from derivatives or securities. So our idea was to use the Sandbox to test an ICO project that is comparable in terms of its purposes with IPO. So it's basically the purpose is raising money, and the issuer of tokens was a company called Level 1. They are producing platforms and software and the digital custodian was R&D, and the underwriter was Sberbank KIP. So we issued 285,000 tokens. They were reflected on our platform, on our account, at us as an operator to the amount of 10 million rubles. So that was the actual transaction. What happened in the process of the transaction is that, yes, the technologies do work, and FinTech provided us with a platform called MasterChain for our experiment. FinTech Association created this platform. Those technologies work fine, all the cash flows are clear, but we didn't do the assessment of reappraisal or secondary sales. That was a relatively simple procedure. Issuance and return of tokens as payments in other services. It was very important for us to get the support of the central bank, and indeed many processes were discussed in the process of preparation of this project. And I'd like to say the following. We did manage to find answers to all the questions immediately. Namely, what is a token on the balance of Sberbank? Is it a financial liability or is it a reserve? What is the right way to reflect that from the legal viewpoint? From the viewpoint of bureaucracy, in the classical perception of this word, we also faced this problem, and we drew the attention of our colleagues from the central bank to this aspect. The technologies of innovations that we work on is a technology that gets outdated very quickly. In a month's time, this technology is available with our competitors or is developing faster than the one who actually initiated this technology. And in this regard, reaction to implementation and adoption of those technologies have to be very prompt. The response has to be very prompt from the company and from the regulator. And that brings us in a very tough competition with global jurisdictions. If we take a look at Belarus, they created close to perfect jurisdiction for development of innovations. But there are no innovations in our perception of it. And Switzerland, that paid no effort to create a jurisdiction but generally support favorable investment climate, have the so-called Crypto Valley coming into existence. 3,000 new job places were created there. And the more active the regulating creation of such environment is, the more companies would come there that are ready to develop innovative projects and technologies that are actually cross-border in its nature. And we believe it is very important that the Central Bank of Russia, the Russian Parliament, the Federal Assembly are flexible enough and react very quickly regarding introduction of those technologies. Otherwise, we would simply lose some of the activities that we could rightfully opt for. I therefore hope that the first experience that we get, we've been through the Sandbox, is not perfect, but still it is very useful and rather promising. The more so that now we see that this project is a technology that was tested sufficiently, and it very well correlates with the activities of the Russian Parliament on creation of the law on digital assets. So all the discrepancies we felt during our pilot project will now find their reflection in this law on digital assets that will form and frame this environment. I also would like to reiterate that it is very important in our view to create an innovative culture and environment in general, what is called an investment climate. And then technologies, legally friendly environment for investors will enable us to compete globally for money of global investors that are ready to invest in those types of assets. Thank you. Thank you, Adi. Well, I would say that the draft law on digital financial assets is already at the stage of consideration and hearing. It would probably take just a couple of sentences to be added there. Actually, it was prepared specifically to coincide with the Phenopolis, so we will fine-tune it. and tomorrow we'll submit it for approval to the presidential administration. And afterwards, of course, there's still a lot of work to be done. And by the way, tomorrow I will share with you some clauses of this draft law. Some of you would be disappointed, some of the contrary would be happy to see it. Well, it's rather conservative in nature, since we believe that it is important to go step by step and gradually create legal opportunities for use of different tools and instruments in this area. However, I believe this project is quite efficient, and many of those who work in crowdfunding and do that efficiently will be able to operate in a legal field to do ICOs, and thanks to that, our startups will have access to broader financing opportunities through all the platforms that deserve trust. So it is important for us that those technological platforms are reliable. And of course, it is important for us to have platforms that meet our requirements from the viewpoint of the technological and innovative components. And in order to keep track of it and allow them in our sandbox, we have a group of individuals, and Konstantin Parshin, who is the Vice President and the Executive Director of Skolkovo Foundation, is a member of such a group, and I hope he will be able to talk about that, because Skolkovo Foundation is a technological sandbox of the kind. So would you please share with us what is the process for selection of the members of this sandbox? Thank you for your question. I'm very happy to be able to address this professional audience. Of course, many of you have heard about Skolkovo, but I think it's still good if I would talk about the latest developments to you. We are growing and developing quickly, and we will be celebrating a threshold of around 2,000 companies that are participants of Skolkovo project in about 8 years since the moment of launch of the project. And clearly, this is not just a figure. Of course, there were very many companies that were requested to leave the project at a certain point. It was an ongoing filtration, also at the entrance point. And I'd like to remind you that according to the rules of Skolkovo projects, we do an independent expertise and examination of any project that is applying to become a member of Skolkovo Foundation. We're also very proud of it, and we are proud to have one of the most powerful and skillful panel of experts, because those are the same experts used by many other development institutions, the Medium and Size Enterprises Corporation, Внешэконом Bank. So those are around 500 experts. 1/3 of them are foreign experts, and they very carefully scrutinize those projects. And the key requirement is, of course, the project has to be innovative, no reiteration of something we've had before, and an opportunity for commercialization of the project. And another separate criteria is the potential on foreign markets. So we support a project that can be implemented not just within the scope of one jurisdiction. And the figures we get as a result is that around 10 to 15% of the projects successfully go through this expertise. And this examination provides very good feedback to the applicant, and they get this feedback for free. You can go through this expertise or examination more than once, and some projects change their application and finally do become residents of Skolkovo. And Skolkovo as a development institution is offering a whole set of measures of support for our residents. I will not cover all of them. It would take too much time, but briefly, there are two components. Financial means of support. We have a very serious set of subsidies, exemption from customs duties and some taxes. System of grants, of course. Our grants are very diverse. They are aimed at different stages of development of a startup, different levels of development of technologies, and the size of the project. And the second element is non-financial support. And lately, we've been paying a lot of attention to this particular aspect because this support is connected with business development directly. We have extremely skilled employees, and we have dedicated services. For example, we have a separate department on IP rights protection for innovative startups. Of course, it is one of the key elements of value creation on the market and raising investment. So that is the service we've been rendering to them for quite a long while, rather successfully, by compensating the expenses for that through certain grant procedures. There is also a service offered by our subsidiary, Skolkovo Ventures, the support in finding investors. And so far under management, there are 3 venture funds that enable startups to have a seamless transition from a very early stage of getting a primary grant to reaching a stage of a pilot project and the scalability stage when they can go to the big market. And of course, that is our accelerator. Although we prefer to name not acceleration but industrialization. By saying that, we mean that we support those companies not for a short period of, let's say, 2 to 3 months. No, we are with there for about a year or 2, and there are many successful examples of it. I'm not advertising the company, but again, if you have time, there is a so-called Alley of Startups in this forum, and the Alley of Startups are former winners of different Finnopolises, and they will be happy to show you the level of success they managed to achieve, also thanks to cooperation with Skolkovo Foundation. So those support measures are aimed to offer a full set of measures that can be customized depending on the company and would support the company to accelerate the process of reaching the market. And coming back to the topic of our today's conversation, it is very important for us to synchronize our startups in regards where they need to interact with the regulator, where they need a deep understanding of the market, and we bring them in touch with the mechanism and institutions that operate in this specific area. So we're very happy to have close collaboration with the central bank, and we always try to support our startups in better understanding of the opportunities offered by the Sandbox. Thank you very much, Konstantin. And as a follow-up to this technological discussion and the technological approach in selecting startups and projects offered by our Sandbox, I know that in this room we have people that would be ready to offer their project for testing in a Sandbox, and I would like to invite Tatiana Zharkova, who is the chairman of the Expert Council of Financial Market Participants, to express her position on that and share with us the criteria that you use when you select a project for that testing. Well, I generally would like to say that the topic of our today's forum is mostly focused around the creation of new customer experience. We talk about development of financial technologies, we talk about development of digital economy, development of competition, and first and foremost, we're seeing that it is possible thanks to new technologies that can be applied. And creation of that kind of regulatory sandbox, thanks to our regulator, enables the market to synchronize those technologies with the tempo of regulatory changes. And our expert council is aiming to assess the offers we get regarding the innovative component. We have 5 key criteria. The first criteria we analyze is that the proposal we get And we get it only after the examination of the Department of Financial Technologies of the Central Bank. And we analyze accessibility of the services that are planned to be implemented within the framework of this case. That also includes whether re-implementation of this case would impact creation of a new customer experience, and whether this application and this project would enable us to increase the efficiency. On the other hand, as I said, we always analyze the innovative aspect of this project. Of course, there is a technological aspect to that when we analyze creation of projects with the use of innovative technologies. But there are also projects that apply to creation of a new business process and as a consequence of a new customer experience, and we had such processes as well. On the other hand, we always assess risks, and those risks might be in different dimensions. That includes financial risks at the stage of implementation of the project, IT security risks, and in this regard, the greater part of examination is done by the central bank. And we on our side also analyze the risks that emerge within the scope of IT security. And of course, we analyze the implementation risks. We analyze whether the architecture of the business process is properly developed, whether there is a prototype created, whether the regulatory barriers are nicely developed. And the key objective is to understand what are the regulatory hurdles and barriers that stand in the way of development of this unique project. Each project is, of course, unique for us, and we want it to be implemented. And another important aspect is general assessment of the impact of implementation of this project on the market.
And our evaluation is really comparable to how they do it at school, whether it will have high impact, medium impact, or low impact. High impact can mean a lot of changes to a specific service or to a segment of the market when new businesses can be created on even niches for new businesses, and it can be a lot of impact for market in general. This is how we examine applications. We try to discuss all the questions the experts have within the expert group that examines the application. But so far, we were able to support all the applications that we've had. Thank you so much. So this testing that we do is in a way theoretical, because we don't track the practical consequences and how it will play out in the market. So we do have the risks that whatever has been tested in the sandbox can have a different impact in the market. There are regions in Russia, we have governors who have contacted us to pilot these ideas. So what is your vision in this regard? Do you think it's worthwhile? Well, it's slightly controversial, but I'm happy to comment. I think as of today, in terms of applications that we see, it would be wiser to support the existing approach to the regulatory sandbox. There's a lot of discussions, as I said, and that they get heated. It's also because we ask our applicants about their impact, about their potential. And as Ivan mentioned, these discussions help the applicants to really understand the project on a theoretical level, because setting the goals right is already half the success, isn't it? And therefore, I believe that the sandbox actually teaches the market about how to set goals correctly from the technical point of view, from the contextual point of view, and so on. So international experience tells us there's about 15 such sandbox. globally, and there are different approaches. Sorry, I'm a little late. Perhaps you've discussed that already. And in August this year, 11 different national regulators came together to create a common center for information technology where they would share experiences in this field. And therefore, we believe this is good as a first step, but other steps perhaps should follow. As soon as we're ready, the market is ready, and all of us. Thank you, Tatiana. You nicely bridged to what I expect as John's input, and I mean his vast experience in all of those sandboxes, especially because he represents the UK, where this was pioneered. And maybe, John, you will also be able to take my question, whether we should expand onto pilot regions, not just have this almost virtual sandbox as we do now. And as Tatiana said, given that now there is this international alliance that allows for experience exchange and testing on the transnational level, what is your stance on that? John, the floor is yours.
Anatoly, let me turn myself down in my ear. There we go, that's better. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to speak, and also secondly, apologies that I'm speaking in English rather than in Russian. I think the introduction of the GFIN, the Global Financial Innovation Network, I think as the FCA has called it, which is the FCA and 11 other regulators. It includes the Monetary Authority of Singapore, it includes HKMA, as well as a number of others. I think is probably in a direct response to what we saw coming out of the first rounds from the sandbox that was introduced in the UK. So the FCA first introduced its sandbox in 2016. It's had something like 5 rounds of what we would call cohorts. So there are 2 cohorts per annum. They run for 6 months. We've had something like 300 companies apply. Something like 101, 102 companies have been accepted into those testing environments for their applications. And out of that, some of the feedback that came was they would like greater access to cross-border, cross-jurisdictional sandboxes, in that it was very limited to the UK, and they would benefit from that. So I think the GFIN is a direct response from the FCA, amongst others, to say, well, let's try and create a network of regulators where information can be shared, the regulators can benefit from the innovation that they're seeing and how people are applying that innovation. Unfortunately, I think it is a bit of a truism that regulation lags innovation. We tend to find, if you look at MiFID, for example, which has been very close to my heart for the last 2 years or so, that took 10 years to implement, from when we had the original meetings in 2008 in Pittsburgh at the G20 to 2018 when MiFID actually got implemented. And technology and innovation is just moving too quickly for regulation to follow at that sort of pace. So I think the sandboxes are a great opportunity, not only for startups to get involved with understanding the implications on their technology as far as the regulator is concerned, but also for the regulators to understand what those technological and innovational developments in the marketplace are and how they can then potentially foresee regulation around that. And so I think that extension is a natural extension to a network of regulators who can then collaborate amongst themselves and offer a network feedback to those organizations who are trying to implement, perhaps such as Sberbank or others, implement a solution that covers both Russia, London, and Asia. It would be great, I would imagine, for Anatoly here to be able to test that against real data in those environments with real regulators looking at the results rather than testing in an isolated fashion in a laboratory.
Жон, ну у меня тоже вот возник вопрос.
Have you ever seen examples of maybe when a smaller company plays in the sandbox, that it's an opportunity for them? They can, in a way, get support from the regulator, and it's a testimony of the quality of the product in a way. But it's costly to try this out in the sandbox. And for a very small company, this can cost too much. And this can really undermine their whole business model. So they tried and they don't succeed, and they decide to discontinue. Have you seen examples of that? And do you think it's an issue at all?
Translation. Yes, there have been examples, but I think if you look at the statistics around the FCA Sandbox, something like 80% of applications have been from startups. So it's very much seen as something that will attract startups to it. Its success in the Sandbox is seen as a sort of a stamp of approval, almost a badge of honor. And of those companies that have gone into the testing phase, something like 40% have then gone on to secure additional funding. So being in the Sandbox is definitely seen as something to be proud of, and something that will help you succeed as an organization, potentially. Having said that, yes, there are risks and costs associated with that. The FCA looks to assign a case officer to each organization. That case officer, in some respects, looks to reduce the costs of regulatory consultancy that startup would otherwise need to incur. And also the FCA restricts authorizations. And looking at some of the analysis that they have done, that restricted authorization is perhaps the most widely used tool. So they only authorize that element which is actually in testing. They don't let the company, if you like, apply for a full authorization and therefore incur that full cost. So even though there are risks, I think the Sandbox actually helps control those risks more for the startup than if they were to just develop in isolation and then turn up at the regulator's front door and say, I have this wonderful product, please authorize me or please approve me. I think the Sandbox enables that startup to take steps. And in some instances, some organizations have changed their business model. They have decided that the final 20%, which is what needs authorization, isn't worth doing. So they'll develop the 80%, they'll stick as being a technology provider that doesn't need to be authorized. It's a perfectly good business model to go into. And they won't go that last mile. So I think some organizations have taken the opportunity of the Sandbox to actually change the business model in flight as a direct consequence of the feedback that they've received. And again, I'd see that, and I think they would see that as a positive outcome rather than a negative outcome.
Спасибо, Джон.
Thank you, John. We still have time. I'd like to now invite all the speakers, all the panelists, to share some advice to potential Sandbox applicants. And I would like to start with you, Eddie, since you sit next to mine. This is also the last panel of the day, so if you have a joke or two to throw into your advice, you're welcome. Eddie. The discussion that we've had today, I'd like to start with a warning. I don't want Sandbox to act as a bottleneck. What I mean, if it's only about that badge of honor for marketing, then this will be a bottleneck that will kill off innovation. Therefore, I believe that Sandbox must have priorities and fairly strict criteria for applicant selection. I'm sure that there are startups who can do without the Sandbox. But we have a lot of creative people in this country. And if you don't have specific criteria, then they will bring you everything. And since we've only started with this, and there's a lot to improve, I think it's very important to be transparent about what we do and what we don't do. I think this will be beneficial for the market and the industry. Ivan? Since I have the task, together with my colleagues, to study the applications that we receive, I see a number of issues that are common to these applications, and I think the most general piece of advice that I can give, that we frequently voice, is that we would like the applications to work with their idea more thoroughly, not just from technological and legal points of view, but also from the end goal, not having a clear vision for the mission, for what they want to achieve, because this is something that we cannot do in your stead. This is outside of our competence zone, and we would want such applications to be more comprehensive, to understand the potential audience, to understand their DNA, and because these are the questions that really profile the rest of their activity. And if they have that, then we will be in a better position to help. I have a question to what you just said. You have a list of criteria on the website that the applicants should try to match. Do you think they're exhaustive? If I were to prepare an application, perhaps there's not enough on the website, or don't they just, maybe they don't pay attention? Well, yes, they don't read them as thoroughly to start with. Sometimes they don't give value to what we give value to. I think a frequent case is also security. A very clear parameter, and it's questionable in many ideas that we receive. So it's sometimes unsure whether the startup is up to the criteria that we've set, and it's hard for us to understand whether this is a positive or negative example if the security impact of this service is controversial or unclear. And this is something that tends to be less understood in the applications. Anatoly, Sberbank has huge intellectual potential, and you're able to generate many projects. But could you please give advice to other players in the market on how they could best test their ideas in the sandbox? I'd like to actually discuss the format of the sandbox. I'd like to invite other regulators to the sandbox. Anyone who's regulating entrepreneurship and business, because it's not just the Bank of Russia that is making decision. It's also the tax authorities, a number of other agencies. So I would like first to have more participants on behalf of the government. As for the applicants or potential applicants, I don't think there's any magic behind this. I think that's why it's called a sandbox. Just go and dabble. Just get your hands dirty. You can talk to the people who run it in a pretty informal fashion. There's not a lot of protocol around it. I think these people are very accessible. We don't waste time. We don't. Olga Nikolaevna's been supporting the project a great deal, and we just chat on WhatsApp about our different projects when we get stuck, for example. So it's fairly informal. You know, as Agile teaches us that you have to have fortnightly sprints. So that's what we try to achieve as well, to make sure things move. And I think it will be a good thing if we expand the sandbox. It will become more ambitious, I think. I would like to comment on what Anatoly has said. We're friendly, yes. At the sandbox, we're friendly people. In terms of expanding the sandbox, now we have quite a few state agencies represented, 5 overall as of now, and they work directly with digitization, communications, financial monitoring, Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Economy, and so on. Perhaps, yes, we should involve tax authority. They take part from time to time. When there are specific risks, then we can bring law enforcement agencies. We consult with other agencies as well. We want their opinion. We want a comprehensive vision of applications. We want to design roadmaps that would be accepted by all the agencies without wasting months to receive that support.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Now I'd like to ask John and ask you for advice. What do you think is necessary, in your view? What should be done in a Russian sandbox so it's most efficient? Just to look from the outside.
I think in terms of the experiences that we've seen in the UK with the FCA, then if you're a technology company, if you're a startup, understand your technical architecture well, understand where that architecture needs the authorization and the approval of the regulator. That may be, as Eddie touched on earlier, that may best be done via a partnership with an organization that already has an approval in that area, perhaps an underlying payment mechanism or so on. It might not be that you've got to go and develop that yourself. So I think understanding your technical architecture very well before you then decide to go into that sandbox environment. If you decide to cross the road and move into that sandbox, then I think understand the rules and regulations that apply. One thing that the FCA has found is that navigating the FCA handbook has been difficult for organizations. Those that have a financial services background have found it much easier than those technologists, those innovators that haven't had a financial services background. So in order to encourage innovators and technologists into the sandbox, having an easier way to navigate the rule book, having an easier way to navigate the handbook is something that I would advocate as would be useful from a Russian sandbox perspective to help innovators and technologists be a part of it, not just feel it's limited to those with a financial services background. So those are the sorts of lessons that the FCA seems to have learned. It seems more about greater collaboration across the cohorts. It seems more about communication between the regulator and the actual applicants themselves. So I think those are some useful lessons that perhaps the Russian sandbox could benefit from in looking at the 3 years or so that the FCA system has been running.
Thank you very much for your advice. Konstantin, what would be your recommendation? I would add only a couple of words. In fact, I wanted to support and slightly elaborate on the idea expressed by John. It happens so that Tatiana and myself are members of this expert council that Tatiana is head of. And apart from my role representing Skolkovo, I'm also a member of this expert council. And we do see it from the applications. We do meet individual applicants. Sometimes they contact me and ask me, I've heard about the Sandbox. What's the way to get in? How does it work? I'm sure there must be a shortcut for the ones that are closer to the mighty ones. And that is the key problem of communication, of inefficient communication. There are problems on both sides. Startups, just like many other companies, do not have much trust for the government, governmental structures, and that type of sandbox. They find it hard to believe that those mechanisms are created specifically to help them. That's probably a Russian peculiarity, and business is generally anxious of working or talking to the governmental authorities and the regulator. So a very good step forward was made by the central bank in September of this year. The central bank organized an event specifically for startups. Maybe some of the audience have been there. It was an amazing dialogue. It was started in a rather formal way, but at the end of the event, it was indeed a very lively and open conversation, and you could literally see the level of trust growing in front of your eyes. Of course, there were some questions left unanswered, but it is a clear proof of the fact that that kind of discussions are very much needed and wanted, and they should be continued. And just as John said, we also have this hypothesis. So far, startups didn't go through this expert council. Mostly those were either banks, and it was easy for them because they have much more riper applications. So we have a concern that probably startups might need extra consulting or extra advice. I don't know whether that should be done by the central bank or we expect the startups to do it on their own and find those consultants. But yeah, it would be useful. A bit of compliance advice, a bit of financial literacy exercises, legal aspects. It's just that those are people from very different backgrounds, not always financial background, but maybe great technological idea. And they need this support so that they could probably read into those financial documents. So yeah, I think that's a very valuable idea to maybe think of some kind of consulting service. Maybe it would be for free, but that would clearly support them into entering this sandbox. And I guess this level of support would be appropriate for both parties. Maybe Skolkovo Foundation could overtake this role. Well, jokes apart, I think we could do that, because you represent both the technological component and the financial one. Well, we do have the necessary experts. Probably we could get them engaged in this process. Tatiana, what do you think? Is there a need to do that and think of some outsourcing of consultancy and advice for startups before they go to a sandbox? Well, actually, I think we have everything in place. We do have Skolkovo Foundation that is doing their educational works. We have FinTech platform. And as for the projects that are in the core of our technologies, we're also doing our expertise and work together with our colleagues. And finally, we have a whole market of technological, business and financial and IT consultancies. So I think the step that was made last year, or maybe at the beginning of this year, the idea of this regulatory sandbox, it feels like a long story, but it started lately. I think that is a very clear message to the market, that you should not be afraid to come to the sandbox and create those castles made of sand to make your dreams come true. No need to be afraid. You have the sandbox, you have the sand. All we need is a spade. That is probably the required competence, because the market is also open for it. We just take some courage in Dave and belief in your objective and a readiness to change something. And I only think with optimism and belief in being able to change, we need to head into this sandbox and change the world for the better. I think Ivan would like to add something. Well, free consultancy can only be rendered by the central bank. No other free advice you can get, and that is true. Because all the projects that we see, I think if we would work with them before the application and the course of application, out of 27 projects, there might be like 2 of them in a sandbox. So indeed, we work a lot with the applicants, and our objective is very simple. It is not a kind of formality. We really want it to work, and we have a whole team that works specifically on this area by offering advice and recommendation to guys and their teams to work with them on those technological issues. And sometimes up to the moment of an official receipt of the application, we do internal consultations with our colleagues so that the whole process goes much faster. If our colleagues from the market or association could create some extra competences that would be relatively cheap and convenient for those projects, I think that would be a very good step forward. That would make the work we do of a high quality. All right, then, we're moving strictly according to a schedule. I have just 1 minute left for closing remarks. I do believe it was a useful discussion, including for those who are thinking of coming to a sandbox. And I would say that this sandbox cannot serve as an institution where all the ideas are submersed and ideas maybe with some narrow scope of application of development of business or market. Still, the ideas that are welcomed by a sandbox have to have this general market appeal, and they should be later used by many, many other different organizations, although you would be a pioneer in one specific way. And myself, as a representative of a legislator, is interested in having the ideas that require certain legislative amendments. And of course, the corresponding amendments would be made, and hereby we create a legal field that would enable other companies to implement their ideas. I would like to thank all the participants of the panel, and I thank the audience.